So again, welcome everyone. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Professor Igor Belyaev, who is an associate professor and the head of the Department of Radiobiology at the Biomedical Research Center of the Slovak Academy of Sciences. He has studied electromagnetic fields, including millimeter waves, since 1986, and has shown that effects from microwaves are frequency dependent. Today, he will be speaking to us about the biological and health effects of non-ionizing radiation used by fifth generation wireless networks, or 5G. Professor Belyaev, welcome. Very excited to have you here, and handing over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. And today I would like to speak about biological and health effects of non-ionizing radiation, which is used by 5G mobile communication. Next slide, please. So, and it's generally accepted that biological effects of radio frequency radiation is classified in two different groups. So we talk about so-called thermal effects, and the condition is temperature rise. So if you see the temperature rise, and the effect is thermal. And also we talk about so-called non-thermal effects, which are induced by mobile phones and base stations and stuff like this. So, and actually, non-thermal effects of microwaves have been studied already for more than 50 years. And multiple scientific groups over the world described various kinds of this type of effects, including those which relate to cancer risk and other health risks. And these effects have recently been examined by the European Academy of Environmental Medicine and by the European Institute of Cancer and Environmental Research. Next slide, please. So in 2011, radio frequency radiation, including that from mobile phones, has been classified by the International Agency for Research in Cancer, IARC, as a possible carcinogen, so-called group 2B. So actually, this classification was mostly based on data showing increased risks of brain cancer in those persons which heavily use mobile phones. Importantly, in 2019, the advisory group of 29 researchers of the IARC stated that the majority of new data obtained since 2011 indicate that carcinogenicity of radio frequency radiation should be re-evaluated. Next slide, please. So what is the most important issue with non-thermal effects of radio frequency radiation is a strong dependence of these effects on number of physical and biological variables. So if you talk about physical variables, those are like carrier frequency, intensity, polarization, modulation, and also background static and alternating magnetic fields, duration of exposure, and some other parameters as well. Among biological parameters, genotype and individual sensitivity has been shown to be important. Next slide, please. So if you talk about mobile communication, so we classify them into different groups, starting with 1G, then 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G mobile communication. And all of those types of mobile communication use different frequency ranges. If we see 5G, so it uses frequency ranges of 2G, 3G, 4G, and plus frequency range in between 3 and 30 gigahertz. What is the nearest future? And also millimeter waves. So millimeter waves, by definition, are those waves which have wavelengths in between 1 and 10 millimeters and frequency in between 30 and 300 gigahertz. Next slide, please. As early as in 1968, famous physician, Dr. Herbert Froelich, has suggested a very important theory, so-called long-range coherence and energy storage in biological system. And according to this theory, biological systems support coherence excitations in the frequency range 10 to the power 9 till 10 to the power 11 gigahertz. So it's a range which covers also millimeter waves for regulation of homeostasis. And the prediction of this theory was that non-thermal millimeter waves at specific frequency can affect biological systems. Several research groups from Germany and Canada and other have found afterwards that actually this prediction was confirmed in experiments. So here you can see experiments by Werner Grundler and Fritz Keilmann from Germany, which have shown that, previous slide, please. Yes, which have shown that millimeter waves at very specific frequencies can either increase or decrease growth rate of yeast cells. Here's a decrease, here's an increase. Next slide, please. But the most data were produced in ex-USSR countries. And actually, in 1972, the first book on biological and health effects of millimeter waves has been published in Soviet Union. And afterwards, multiple studies were performed, and some other books on this subject have been published in Russian. Next slide, please. There are also reviews of Russian studies which are available in English. So one is by Andrei Pakhomov and co-authors, and another one, it's our review from 2002. Next slide, please. So actually, millimeter waves have been studied in Soviet Union because it has been shown that under specific condition of localized exposure, they can treat different human diseases. So actually, about 50 different human diseases have been treated by millimeter waves in Soviet Union. So, and there were more than 100 different devices produced for this type of treatment. Here you can see one example. So this is a wide band generator, so-called POROG, which has been approved in 1990 by the Soviet Ministry of Health for so-called microwave resonance therapy. So, and usually this therapy used millimeter wave frequency about 42 gigahertz, about 50 and 60 gigahertz, or alternatively, physicians have selected so-called therapeutic frequency based on sensory feelings of patients. In this case, treatment was performed at individual for each patient frequency. The intensity of exposure was very low, so in between microwatts till milliwatts per centimeter squared, and always this exposure was localized, either applied to acupuncture points or zones of affected organs on skin. So the session duration was about 15 minutes, and usually it was up to 15 sessions. Next slide, please. So I have studied effects of millimeter waves about 20 years, since 1986. And the main endpoint, what we analyzed, was condensation of chromosomes. And particularly, we analyzed this level of condensation, so-called DNA loop structure. Next slide, please. So we used technique which is called anomalous viscosity time dependence, which, similar to neutral comet assay, measures relaxation or condensation of DNA loops. Here's a normal nuclei, normal AVTD curve, relaxed chromatin, relaxed curve, and condensed structure corresponding to this curve. Next slide, please. So important finding was that effects on chromatin condensation when we exposed living cells depended strongly on frequency of millimeter waves. So in this graph, you can see this kind of response. So decondensation of chromatin was observed in very specific frequency windows. We also call them resonances, while at other frequencies, no effects were observed. Of course, these data were obtained with very low intensities, comparable with intensities produced by base stations. Next slide, please. Very important variable which characterizes electromagnetic waves is a so-called polarization, which defines mutual orientation of electric, magnetic field, and direction of wave propagation. So at this slide, you can see a schematic presentation of so-called vertically polarized radio wave. Next slide, please. So, of course, it can be also circular polarization. In this case, the electric field should rotate either clockwise, or it's called also right-handed polarization, or anti-clockwise. So it's also called left circular polarization. In quantum physics, these two polarization correspond to a quantum number S, which is aligned with direction of photons for right-handed polarization, or vice versa for left-handed polarization. Next slide, please. So we was the first group which have studied dependence of millimeter wave effects on polarization. Here you can see a photo of our experimental system, which gave a possibility to irradiate cells simultaneously at the same intensity, at the same frequency, but at different polarizations. So linear polarization, right-handed polarization, circular polarization, and left-handed circular polarization. Next slide, please. So we have published a number of papers, and in conclusion, all those data clearly indicated that in each resonance, which has been defined using linear polarization, only one of two possible circular polarization was effective, either right one or left one circular polarization. So this data provided strong evidence for, first of all, for importance of polarization in effects of millimeter waves. Also, they clearly prove that the nature of effect was non-thermal. They also suggested some possible physical mechanism how it can happen, and also indicated right to left circular structure of the target, which is we believe is DNA. Next slide, please. So here you can see the typical dependence of millimeter wave effects on at resonance frequency on intensity. So here you can see this non-thermal level of intensities. Usually you observe some growth and then a plateau. At subthermal intensities, when you observe some heating of exposed tissue, non-thermal effects may even disappear. Next slide, please. What was also very important, what we found, was the role of exposure duration. So those curves were obtained with different intensities, which are indicated here, 10 to the minus 18 till 10 to the minus 14. So, and it's clear from this data, then if you would like to get this type of effect at this level, so only 6-fold increase of exposure duration from this point to this point compensate 1,000-fold decrease of power intensity. And correspondingly, if you would like to get the same effect with 10,000-fold low intensity, you need to increase the duration of exposure only by 7-fold. So actually, duration of exposure is more important than intensity of exposure. Next slide, please. It was also found in our studies, as well in studies by other research groups, that non-thermal effects of radio frequency radiation, including millimeter waves, depend on stray static magnetic fields and extremely low frequency magnetic fields at the location of exposure. So we found, for example, that if we change the static magnetic field only by 20 microtesla, then this change completely abolished resonance effect of millimeter waves on living cells. Next slide, please. Of course, modulation is very important. Here you can see some very simple types of modulation, like frequency modulation, amplitude modulation, and so on. And to the right, you can see a real modulation of real mobile phone signals, like modulation for 2G signals and modulation to 3G symbols. Can you see here that there are very sharp pulses here? And that is very important, as I will talk later on. Next slide, please. So actually, it was a lot of studies reviewed recently by Henry Lai and co-authors that modulation is also very important for observation of effects of millimeter waves. So what is about detrimental effects of millimeter waves? So actually, the main focus of previous studies of millimeter waves was focused, those studies were focused on medical application. So actually, no one study has been designed to assess health risks. But on the other hand, those medical studies, they reported, at least few studies, they reported number of side effects of millimeter wave exposure, which are mentioned here, for example. Also, few studies have been performed to analyze possible genotoxic effects. Some of them did not see mutagenicity, while other studies did detected some mutagenic effects. For example, in our studies, we have seen and reported inhibition of DNA repair induced by ionizing radiation by subsequent exposure to millimeter waves. Next slide, please. Next slide. it's usually discussed that millimeter waves only shortly penetrate to human body, only to skin. So actually, it's not the case, because when very fast pulses, you remember I have shown some modulation pictures, when very short pulses radiation enters to the human body, it generates so-called burst of energy, which is called brilliant precursors, which can penetrate much deeper to the human body. So this is a continuous wave penetration. This is brilliant precursors penetration. So you see how much different penetration of this kind of sharp pulses like used in mobile communication. So next slide, please. So now, finally, I came to my conclusions. And the first one, very important issue, so that biological effects of non-thermal radio frequency radiation, including millimeter waves, depend on number of parameters, physical and biological. And all those signals actually should be considered separately when studying biological effects and health risks. So it's also very well known that implementation of 5G technology will dramatically increase exposure to radio frequency radiation. And also, it will result in exceeding of frequency range till millimeter waves. And based on possible role of millimeter waves in regulation of homeostasis and lack of adaptation to millimeter waves because of high absorption in air. So we can expect that the health risk of chronic exposure to 5G may be more significant than any other frequency range. The implementation of 5G technology, in my opinion, is therefore premature, and extensive research with chronic exposure of human cells, animals, and humans is needed to rule out potentially harmful effects. And what is good is that the data which show dependence of radio frequency radiation, including millimeter waves, on multiple parameters like frequency, polarization, and strain electromagnetic fields, they did suggest that there are strategies available for reducing health effects from radiation of mobile communication. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Belyaev. What a fascinating presentation. I want to remind our audience on the different streaming platforms, if you do have a question as you're listening to these presentations, to please put them in the chat so that we can collect them for the panel discussion. Unfortunately, Professor Belyaev will not be able to join us for the panel, but I do have a follow-up question for you. And it is, so we're going to answer that now. So are you aware of any studies that are looking at the synergistic effects of multiple sources of exposure, for example, like Wi-Fi, small cells, cell towers, smart meters, etc., on the health of the population? If yes, what do those studies tell us? And if not, how have the governments of this world gotten away with the rollout of experimental technology without addressing the cumulative exposure in the environment?
So actually, I'm not aware of such studies, and so probably they exist, but I miss them probably. But I think that the question is very important actually, and all those sources should be taken into account for definition of health risk and for providing guidelines of exposure. So I agree with you in that issue.
Thank you for that answer. Well, if you're not aware of the studies, I think it's likely that they don't exist. So thank you so much, Professor Belyaev, again, for a fascinating presentation.